Listen closely because the signal is fading and they are actively scrubbing this data from the public servers as I speak. But you need to understand that January 2026 wasn't just a shift in the geopolitical wind, it was a controlled demolition of the reality you thought you lived in. And the architects of this chaos aren't sitting in the Kremlin or Beijing. They are sitting in boardrooms in Houston and closed-door strategy sessions in Northern Virginia, where the blood of sovereign nations is traded for quarterly profit margins. The mainstream narrative tells you that the tectonic plates of the world order shifted by accident, that we simply stumbled into a new era of conflict. But that is the first and most dangerous lie, because this entire violent transition from the so-called rules-based order to the era of naked conquest was engineered, calculated, and executed with cold precision by a shadow apparatus that views the American citizenry not as constituents, but as a resource to be managed and a population to be psychologically conditioned. We are witnessing the Janus moment, but the two faces aren't looking at the past and future. They are looking at the profit sheets of the defense industrial complex and the desperate insolvency of the Western banking system. Look at what happened in the first week of January, where the media sold you a story about restoring democracy in Venezuela with Operation Absolute Resolve. But if you scratch the surface of that narrative, you find the sticky black fingerprint of the heavy crude refining lobby and the desperate machinations of a petrodollar system on life support. The decapitation of the Maduro regime wasn't about human rights or narco-terrorism, because if it were, we would have invaded half the world by now. No, this was a hostile corporate takeover enforced by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment and Delta Force, acting as the private enforcement arm for the Gulf Coast refining complex. The specific geology of the Venezuelan Orinoco Belt is the key that the talking heads on cable news are forbidden to mention, because the American refining infrastructure along the Texas and Louisiana coast was engineered 50 years ago to process heavy, sour crude, and for the last decade those refineries have been starving because the shale oil coming out of the Permian Basin is too light and too sweet. So the puppet masters at Valero, Chevron, and the legacy giants of the downstream energy sector have been lobbying behind closed doors in Houston and Washington, demanding a kinetic solution to their feedstock problem. They needed Venezuelan heavy crude to feed the crackers and cokers in Port Arthur and Pascagoula, and they didn't care if they had to burn Caracas to the ground to get it. This is the cui bono that nobody talks about, because the moment U.S. boots hit the ground in Caracas, the stock prices of the refining giants stabilized, while the domestic shale producers in North Dakota and West Texas were unknowingly signed onto a death warrant, because the plan isn't just to steal the oil, it's to flood the market with cheap Venezuelan crude, to lower inflation metrics for the election cycle, while bankrupting the independent American frackers who need $60 oil to service their junk debt. It is a cannibalistic ritual where one sector of the American energy oligarchy uses the U.S. military to destroy another sector of the American energy oligarchy, and the public is sold a psyop about liberation and freedom, while the real objective is breaking the OPEC stranglehold to save the dollar from total collapse. And don't think for a second that the timing was accidental, because while the eyes of the world were glued to the Caribbean, the real existential threat was screaming through the atmosphere over Western Europe at 10 times the speed of sound. The Oreshnik strike on Lviv was the single most terrifying event in modern military history, and the silence from the Western defense establishment is an admission of total impotence. The media told you it was just another missile attack, but they lied by omission because they didn't tell you that the Russian hypersonic glide vehicle shattered the myth of American missile defense superiority in a matter of minutes. The Oreshnik didn't just hit a factory, it flew right through the engagement envelope of the Patriot PAC-3 and the Aegis Ashore systems that we have spent hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars to build and maintain. This is the great grift of the defense primes like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, who have been selling the Pentagon a shield that they knew was full of holes. The Russians fired a missile with dummy warheads, which was a message sent directly to the unspoken rulers of NATO at the Munich Security Conference, and the message was that your technology is obsolete and your Article 5 guarantees are a suicide pact. The use of inert penetrators was the ultimate reflexive control operation because it forced the Western intelligence agencies to admit to themselves that they couldn't stop it even when they knew it was coming, and yet the public narrative remains one of escalation and funding because if the American tax slave realized that the trillion-dollar defense budget bought a Maginot Line in the sky, there would be a revolution tomorrow. The generals know the shield is broken, but they need to keep the contract money flowing, so they suppress the data on the intercept failures and spin a yarn about Russian recklessness while hiding the fact that we are naked in the face of hypersonic physics. And while the oil wars burn in the south and the hypersonic nightmare unfolds in the east, the most insidious play is happening in the silence of the high north, where the Make Greenland Great Again narrative is being spun as a patriotic expansion, but is actually a desperate resource grab orchestrated by the technology conglomerates and the rare earth supply chain managers who are terrified of the Chinese stranglehold. The move to annex Greenland and the Kvanefjeld project isn't about ice or geography. It's about neodymium and dysprosium and the raw materials required to build the F-35s and the guidance chips for the missiles that don't work. The actors here are the mining lobbyists and the shadow consultants for companies like Energy Transition Minerals, who have been taking meetings in the Executive Office building, promising that if the U.S. government uses the threat of force to override Danish sovereignty and Greenlandic environmental laws, they can break the Chinese monopoly. This is the dirty secret of the Green Revolution and the high-tech economy. It requires a return to 19th century imperialism where we simply take the land that has the rocks we need. The PSYOP here is framing this as national security, while in reality it is about securing the profit margins of Apple, Tesla, and Northrop Grumman, who cannot function without these minerals. The ban on uranium mining in Greenland was a democratic decision by the local population, but in the eyes of the deep state democracy is an obstacle to supply chain security, so they are manufacturing a diplomatic crisis to justify an eminent domain seizure on a planetary scale. The convergence of these three events, the oil raid in Venezuela, the hypersonic humiliation in Ukraine, and the land grab in Greenland, is the violent birth of a new world system where international law is entirely abandoned in favor of raw kinetic power and resource extraction. The globalists meeting in Davos and the technocrats in Brussels are terrified because the mask has fallen off and the illusion of a civilized international community has been shattered by the reality of hypersonic nuclear signaling and state-sponsored piracy. They are using the economic warning lights as a pretext to implement draconian controls at home, because they know that when the cheap oil floods in and the domestic shale industry collapses, the resulting economic chaos will require a police state to manage. The Donroe Doctrine is just a branding exercise for the total weaponization of the Western Hemisphere, where every resource from the Amazon to the Arctic is designated as a strategic asset of the empire to be seized and liquidated to keep the Ponzi scheme of the debt-based financial system running for just a few more years. You are being psychologically conditioned to accept war as a permanent state of economic maintenance and to view the seizure of foreign assets as a necessary step to preserve your standard of living, while in reality the elite are looting the periphery of the empire to build their bunkers before the core collapses. The Janus moment is code for the final looting phase, where the pretense of diplomacy is dropped and the predatory nature of the shadow government is revealed in all its ugly glory. So do not believe the headlines, do not believe the State Department briefings, and do not believe that any of this is happening for your benefit, because the only beneficiaries are the shareholders of the defense contractors, the executives of the oil majors, and the technocratic elite who view you as nothing more than collateral damage in their great game of conquest.